titled Building Cultural Humility, Skills and Structures for Racial Justice Work in Schools. And so I'd like to take a moment to read their bios so that you can get to know who they are. Anthony de Jesús is an associate professor in the Department of Social Work and Equitable Community Practice at the University of St. Joseph in West Hartford, Connecticut. He received his MSW at the Boston University School of Social Work and was a school social worker in Boston prior to earning an EDD at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. He previously served as a researcher and administrator at the Centro de Estudios Puertorriqueños and on the faculty at the Silberman School of Social Work at Hunter College. That's where he partnered and hosted the NISWA School Social Work Conference for several years. He is currently conducting a study of the Connecticut Department of Children and Families Racial Justice Initiative. Dr. Madeline Perez de Jesús is an associate professor in the Department of Social Work and Equitable Community Practice at the University of St. Joseph in Connecticut. A lifelong New Yorker, before moving to Connecticut, Madeline received her PhD at the City University of New York's Graduate Center. Her study, Two Tales of One City, a political economy of the New York City public high school admissions process, was awarded honorable distinction in 2011. She co-authored a volume, Theory and Educational Research Toward Critical Social Explanation, in which she has featured a chapter on the experiences of Latina mothers navigating school choice. She's currently working on a book that tells the story of families from two communities at opposite sides of the income ladder searching for access to quality high schools as they navigate the New York City public high school admissions process. Please help me in welcoming Dr. Anthony de Jesús and Dr. Madeline Perez de Jesús.
Thank you.
Good morning.
Buenos dias, good morning. Thank you for that lovely introduction. We're so happy to be here. We thank Cindy Bautista Thomas and the Conference Planning Committee for having us with you all today. Cindy is our colleague in both social work education and also in urban education policy. And we are very aware that this conference is her brainchild, so we're very humbled that she saw us fitting to kick off the day with you today. The name of our talk is Building Cultural Humility, and this morning we seek to parse out this notion of building, right? Building as construction, building as co-construction, building us to have tools to engage in what goes on in schools and around schools as well. And this, of course, includes interfacing with all the different stakeholders in schools, right? So the different staff members, the students, their families, and the community at large, right? And as social workers, we're trained to look at our work through a systems approach. We examine people in their environments, right? So this micro, macro perspective, they go hand in hand. And today we'll continue building cultural humility together by learning and unlearning how we engage as school social workers. So we want to share two foundational assumptions that thread our talk before, we get into the nitty-gritty. The first foundational assumption is that your identity matters, right? So we received this lovely introduction from Cindy, but we also want to add to that one of the ways that we construct and deconstruct is by first examining our own identities, our own stories, right? And this idea of having this educational political autobiography has been present for both of us in a number of ways. For me, it's an assignment that I give to students who are in their first year of college. So in addition to teaching BSW students, I also lead a first-year seminar that serves as an anchor for students to learn and understand the culture of college. My own journey
took me away from New York City to Boston for my MSW, and when I ended up, after several years working in the Boston Public Schools as a school social worker, ended up pursuing my doctorate at Harvard. A very critical course for me was one called Education for Social and Political Change, taught by Profesora Eileen de los Reyes. And that course centered around writing a political autobiography where we would integrate the personal, the political, and the theoretical, these different spheres of knowledge that are often separate. And in academia and institutional life, in social work practice, we tend to value more institutional knowledge, academic knowledge. We tend to devalue personal experiences, the way that people engage, lived experience. And so this assignment really helped us to kind of bring all of that together. And so part of what we think is important as a foundation for understanding and constantly building, rebuilding, deconstructing our own skill set is this autobiography process. In our current institution, as we were starting our MSW program, incorporated that into a culture, diversity, and human rights course as a critical cultural autobiography. So these notions of informed by critical social science paradigms that are really looking to take apart and reconstruct, understand, get underneath what are the experiences, the inputs that shape our identities, our multiple and intersecting identities, how they evolve over time, how does that inform, influence, and shape our work, often in ways that we're not even aware of.
So we'll say a little bit about kind of these formal credentials, right? So we're both social work faculty members. We work at the same institution. I work with BSW students, and Tony works with the MSW students.
I followed her to Connecticut.
You did, yeah. It's very interesting to see now that we've been working together for a little over 5 years that there are students who follow this kind of mentoring trajectory, who kind of start off with me and then start working with Tony at the MSW program, right?
And they tell me there's no way that you could be as great as Professor Perez, and then when they finish with me, they start to rethink that.
Well, we complement each other. It's not a competition, right? So we're both former school social worker, and I was a community organizer, right? And we both have these doctorates in education. We worked with folks who are still, just very relevant for us: Pedro Noguera, Jean Agnon, French, and we've built on the work of French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu. But we also think it's really important to position ourselves as people. So, in addition to being a macro social worker, I'm a Puerto Rican woman who was born and raised in Brooklyn.
I'm a diasporican man who was born and raised in the Bronx. So when we got married in Queens.
Queens. Neutral, Switzerland. My parents migrated to New York City as young adults via airplane.
My parents, my mother in particular, was 7 years old when she migrated to New York on the Marine Tiger, which is one of the most famous merchant marine vessels that was symbolized the migration of Puerto Ricans in large numbers to New York.
My household was Spanish dominant. My parents had interrupted education in their early years, and it was not uncommon for them to be absent from school to work on their parents' farm. So the agricultural work was prioritized in Corozal and Isabela.
My parents graduated from high school in New York City in the 50s, which was for them, despite other struggles, a ticket to an upper working class lifestyle. benefiting from subsidized housing and living in the Bronx, in the Soundview section of the Bronx at a time when there was access to opportunity, but there was certainly increased risks for me as a youngster. But these were also protective factors, privileges, as well as disadvantage that we've had the opportunity through these exercises, through this lifelong journey of interrogating our history and our power, privilege, and intersectional identity that is important for us to emphasize.
My mother worked in a factory. My dad was a janitor for many years. And both of our lives changed when we bypassed our local zone schools, which were very under-resourced and quite segregated. And I took this exam and ended up at Brooklyn Technical High School, one of the New York City specialized high schools, which inspired the research I was to do later in life.
My mother was a bookkeeper at Café Bustelo. My father worked as a clerk in the brokerage industry, and they sacrificed to send us to parochial schools, which was the equivalent of which today are many of the different choice options that are on the educational landscape. And I think in retrospect certainly was the way that they bypassed the undesirable options that they saw around them, and also informed by their own experiences in New York City public schools.
So even though we were drawn together through all of our similarities, it's important to really examine the nuances of the differences, right? Michelama, Naicha, both of Puerto Rican descent, different parents migrating at different times and via different ways, right? Different ways to bypass our local schools. And being a man and being a woman, right? Cisgender, and all this, how this plays out very differently in terms of gender role, especially after you have a baby, right?
Yes.
And we're also the parents of a 3-year-old who's in a public magnet school, and that brings another perspective to this work as well, right?
We have skin in the game.
Yeah, it's different. So we're going to do the next slide. So along with that is another foundational assumption, which is not only who we are matters, what our school's agenda is matters, right? So Jean Anyon, wonderful mentor of ours, did a very famous 5-school study in 1981 that it's still very highly referenced today. And the article was called Social Class and the Hidden Curriculum of Work. And Jean observed 5 different elementary schools over the course of a full year. And she concluded that at the 5th grade, students of different economic backgrounds were already being trained and prepared to occupy particular rungs on the socioeconomic ladder. And I'm sure we all see that even earlier than 5th grade, right? She just happened to be looking at that grade. So she looked at curriculum, what was taught, pedagogy, how it was taught, and how we assess kids, right? So I'll just talk a little bit about how those looked at those different schools, and we invite you to think about, where do the schools in your lives lie in this continuum that Jean maps out in terms of the hidden curriculum? And think about the school where you work, schools where you were trained, schools where you send your children to. This all shapes how we engage with these structures, right? So at the working class school, work was defined as following procedure, right? Follow the rules. The rule is the rule. Teachers would say things like, do this or it's wrong. Nothing was explained in terms of the rationale. You just had to do it. There was control, punishment, and often interruptions of the academic work. When I looked at the high school admissions process, I was in a middle school in Spanish Harlem that I call El Barrio Academy. and I followed an ELL class, a class of English language learners, and the kids taught me that the first 3 words in English that they learned was "pardon the interruption," because of all the interruptions they received, right? So that's very telling. At the middle class school, work was defined as getting the right answer, and right answers were often in books. There were all these external rules that you had to follow and that people imposed on you, but they gave you the courtesy of letting you know why, of giving you the rationale. It wasn't just because I said so. It was because that's the rule, because the district wants it that way, right? At the affluent professional school, work was expressed in creative activity, and student work is highlighted everywhere and showcased with pride. Work is carried out independently by students, and rather than control, there's negotiation, right? In terms of having a sense of dynamic between teachers and students. And lastly, at the executive elite school, work is defined as developing analytical intellect, right? Your intellectual powers, critical thinking, which we talk about all the time. And your work is expected to be done independently. And it's okay, it's encouraged to challenge. You can challenge the teacher. You can challenge things that you read in books. You're expected to critique. Teachers are polite, and they allow kids to roam around. And if you have to go to the bathroom, you don't have to ask for permission. People trust you're going to go to the bathroom and come back. There's a different level of respect. As I mentioned earlier, I teach undergraduate students, and University of St. Joseph is one of several colleges that has a graduation requirement in the form of a critical thinking and writing portfolio. Students have to submit a portfolio of 10 different papers that follow a particular rubric that they engage in critical thinking. And it saddens me because when we go to all the receptions leading up to graduation, often the students have rumbles in their tummy, and they feel sick, and they don't look like they're happy to graduate, and it's not a reaction that matches the joy of the accomplishment, and it's because many of them still haven't finished this critical thinking writing portfolio, which is required. So we have a requirement for all students without an acknowledgement that for many of our students, particularly our first generation students, they come from K-12 educational backgrounds where it's not about critical thinking. It's about follow the rules. Yet when you get to college, everybody is assessed on critical thinking. But it's not valued and taught everywhere. And we don't acknowledge that, right? So pay careful attention to where your school lies in this. What do they say they want from kids? And what is really going on, right? Sometimes this is really painfully obvious and we ignore it. So in my community organizing work, one of the projects I worked with was as a consultant for New Visions for public schools. Some of you may be affiliated with New Vision schools. They developed a number of small high schools with a big grant that they got from Bill Gates. And there was a phase out of large, underperforming, under-resourced public high schools. And I worked in these high school campuses where there were between 5 and 7 high schools all together in the building, and principals had to figure out how to share space. And school administrators would openly refer to the phase-out large high school as the dead school. In front of kids, in front of the staff that were trying to kind of keep a sense of balance and integrity as the students were shrinking and the graduation class was becoming smaller and smaller. When we notice differences, or when they notice differences between the resources of the small schools and the large underperforming school, these differences were noticed through these double doors that had windows. So the kids could see, they have teachers that look really enthusiastic, or they have books, or they have laptops. And I remember sharing this with the district administrator, who said, "Don't worry, we'll take care of it. That's a really important observation, Madeline." And when I returned to the school, there was construction paper covering the windows, so people can't see on the other side. right? So think about where your school lies on in terms of the 5-school study, and think about what's happening and what are our reactions. Are we just trying to cover up, right? Or are we acknowledging what's happening? So I saw these similar themes in my work in New York City with parents undergoing public high school admissions. Like Jean, I spent a year. I was in 2 middle schools, a school I call the Gracie School on the Upper East Side, and a school that I call Barrio Academy in East Harlem. Particularly striking is that the schools were 40 blocks apart on the same avenue, and there's no surprise in terms of the different demographics, right? Barrio was 99% Black, brown, and poor. Gracie School was 60% white, Asian, very solidly middle class, and some elite folks, right? And in terms of teachers, at the Gracie School, teachers were experts in their domains. The drama teacher was in a play every summer and served in commercials. The art teacher had her own comic book, right, and sold her art at school auctions to raise money for the school. At El Barrio, teachers had these unfulfilled dreams, and they were angry that they didn't have those dreams fulfilled because they had tough lives. And they would often steal the spotlight from the students. So if you went to a play at El Barrio Academy, the main stars were the teachers, and the kids were in the back singing backup. The choice strategy at Gracie was very proactive from the start of before conception or before birth, because people knew, well, let's move into this district before we plan to have our child so we can get access to this zoning and these schools, right? At El Barrio, choice was imposed upon everybody in the fall of the 8th grade. And even when they tried to engage in choice before, they were dispossessed of schools. Options were changed for them. They were displaced from apartments. The rents would go up and they would have to move. The process at Gracie was defined as, it's not really a choice, but you have to kind of engage in this really sophisticated ranking system. And there was this constant calculation, right? At El Barrio, folks took the rules at face value. That sounds very similar to the working class schools in Jean's study, right? Just follow the rules. There are no unwritten rules. The attitude at Gracie was, public schools are lucky to have us. We can go anywhere else. We could be in the suburbs, we can move out of New York City, we can opt into private school. And at El Barrio, a very common phrase was, pues, let's deal with la que me toca, right? Spanish for the one that I'm assigned. Because they had already had enough experience, not only with school choice, but with life, to know that sometimes you don't really have choice, or there's an appearance of choice, right? So it's important to keep in mind that underpinning all of this is Pierre Bourdieu's notion of cultural capital, right? This idea that there are skills, values, dispositions that are recognized by dominant culture, right? These white middle-class values and dispositions that schools recognize. And when that happens, we're blind to the way that folks are involved in schools in other ways because we don't deem it as appropriate or we don't recognize it. One brief example is I remember asking parents in this study, well, how many open houses did you go to for the high schools, right? And people would talk about different open houses and this whole labyrinth to even get access to the open house, which involves logging on to the website at a particular time and calling relentlessly. So even that is limited, right? Even the access to see the school, not even apply to the school. And there was a father who drove a bus for a living. And he went to visit this school, Young Women's Leadership Academy. And he said, well, I didn't really go to the open house because I didn't have internet and I couldn't do all of that. But I remember driving by the school to see if it was a safe place for my daughter. And I said, well, what did you look at? And he was like, well, I wanted to make sure that there were security guards there, and I wanted to see if the kids were fighting, and I wanted to see if people looked happy. So this kind of image of this Latino dad bus driver peering through his window, right? It's really symbolic of how we engage with families who are not part of this dominant skills. You're always on the periphery, right? You're always kind of peering through the window. And he did what he could to explore schools. The system wasn't set up to support him and do that. And there's filtering even in the investigation level, even as you're even considering schools. And that's really important for us to keep in mind in terms of our work. So I describe these different ways that parents engage in schools as hustles. And the reason I call them hustles is because unlike a lot of literature which defines parents who don't seem to show up in the ways that school recognize as hard to reach or unengaged, what I saw in my study is that all parents were deeply committed to their kids' education, and all of them were engaging in different ways. It just looks different and is appreciated or not recognized, right? So at Gracie, this hustle was defined as whatever your cultural capital is, right? Whatever's recognized, your relationship to time, right? So having the resources to buy and control and manage your time. Housekeepers, au pairs, nannies, food delivery services, having access to transportation, having quick internet service, all of this saves time. Having a job where you control your schedule and have an assistant. All of this buys time that is necessary to even engage in high school admissions. Resources plus relationship to time equals the hustle. So the Gracie families are engaged in this high ground hustle, right? Because they can control their time. They know that there are unwritten rules, right? Because they went to executive elite schools and were taught to be critical and to question. At El Barrio, folks are really struggling. High school admissions is important, but you're also battling with police brutality, issues of immigration, healthcare, communities that are unsafe. There are parents who choose schools based on the school uniform so that to avoid conflicts with gangs. Because if you wear a particular school uniform, that's your reason for those colors. You're not showing a gang affiliation, right? So we don't know these things because we're not asking these questions. So they are engaged in this constant time poverty. And Chin and Newman are these sociologists that brought this term into economic literature, and I use it when navigating schools. So we're constantly engaging in a time poverty that shows up and appears as not caring. But they're just navigating a lot of things, right? So our daughter's 3, and when we ask her a menu type question, such as, a typical question is, Lily, would you like to go to the dinosaur museum or the playground? Lily will take a significant pause, and that happens to be the only characteristic that I find mildly irritating about her dad. Other than that, he's perfect. And then she looks at us and says, both. And then we smile. And we smile because it's such an innocent example that she has learned to test the waters in experimenting with the rules. She didn't fall into, do you want A or B? I want A, B. And this is necessary when we decide as school social workers that we want to advocate as opposed to acquiesce. And there's a relationship between acquiesce and advocacy and the range of the 5-school study.
So the 6 years I worked as a school social worker in Boston, I characterize them as navigating the raging cultural rivers that exist between families, schools, and communities. And I guess I can say that now probably because I'm so far removed from that time in my life, but I have very vivid memories of my work in schools and the challenges, the conflicts, the victories, and the constant sense of frustration that there's so much to do and I can't do enough, or I'm not empowered to do enough. And so I might withdraw, or I might begin to emotionally withdraw. And that frustration motivated my interest in pursuing, and with lots of uncertainty, whether I might pursue doctoral work. And I got that resolved, and here I am. But those experiences, one school I worked in, the first week I was there, I looked as young as I do now, but I was younger, and but being the only Latino staff member in the school, walking into the male staff bathroom, a seasoned teacher in the school sees me go in and says, "Hey fella, where the hell do you think you're going?" And I turned around and I said, "Oh, Mr. Kelly, it's me, Tony de Jesús. Remember we met the other day." And he apologized. But that was clear, it was clear to me, the message that, that he and others were sending to students. And I think that it maps on nicely to Anyan's 5-school study, to the kind of cultures and structures and school climates that convey to students that what you're here to learn is how to follow the rules. And if you depart from that, you don't have the opportunity to kind of navigate. You don't have the opportunity to, as Madeline's example of our daughter, to create other options or to negotiate other options, because it's non-negotiable. So those experiences, other experiences that perhaps some of you are familiar with, that I vividly recall, were kind of the encounters at the classroom door with students who were disruptive and teachers who were at their wits' end and would say, "Here, I need you to fix this kid. What can you do?" And with my social work lens, with the macro lens, with the structural analysis that Madeline has emphasized, would understand, well, this kid is behaving normally under the circumstances that they're in, and how can we intervene? How can we create interventions to support them to behave differently? But there's a tension there, as there are tensions between the interests and the needs of parents and teachers, school social workers, administrators, other personnel working in and around schools. And school social workers have to navigate this on a daily basis. For me, when I began my doctoral work, I kind of was very, very interested in how can schools be more affirming of the cultural and linguistic identities of all students, but in particular Latino students. That took me into kind of a deep immersion in the literature on caring in education, the work of Nell Noddings, Angela Valenzuela, and others. And through that work, and through that journey, came back to New York City and began my dissertation research in Brooklyn at El Puente Academy for Peace and Justice in Williamsburg. And interviewing students there and an ethnographic case study, this notion of caring came up. The antithesis to the experience that Madeline also mentioned of a sense of lack of caring or not caring in schools. That students really talked about their experiences of caring, and my colleague Renee Anthrop Gonzalez and I kind of articulated this from both of our studies, his in a Puerto Rican school, Pedro Albizu Campos in Chicago, and El Puente, where students talked about their experience as being characterized by the provision of high quality interpersonal relationships and high academic expectation with interpersonal support. That this is motivated by this structural analysis that teachers would have in these schools, partly because of the mission and the political orientation of the schools. So that when applied to to school social work practice, this notion of critical care invites us to reflect on our motivations, invites us to think about why and how can I engage students in high quality social work practice, in practice that connects with them and their families on a human level as people, and that pushes against the forces in schools that would really have us marginalize their identities and fit them into boxes that are not appropriate for their development. In this regard, as we were discussing this theme of acquiescence and advocacy comes up. And so in what ways are our own political autobiographies, our own integration or need to further integrate our personal, political, and theoretical spheres informing our work and our behavior with students, with families, with colleagues in schools that either acquiesce to a structure that will reproduce inequality in the lives of students, or that would advocate and resist and disrupt structures that reproduce inequality. So these I think have been very important themes in my work. This brings me to a point in my career now where I've begun to integrate that earlier work in my career on critical care, caring in education, the teacher caring literature, with the work on cultural humility. And frankly, it was really kind of a long frustration with and unease with the concept of cultural competence that led me to that work early in my time as a professor at Hunter, really trying to understand what's useful about the concept that's ubiquitous in social work and health of cultural competence, what are some of the shortcomings of that, and how did that inform this notion of cultural humility. So it was the physicians Turvalon and Murray Garcia that really coined this term in the late 90s and introduced it, and really talked about it as addressing power imbalances in the provider-patient-client relationship, and that the culture of health and mental health provision really focuses on knowledge, and that the knowledge is held and controlled and acquired by the practitioner or the provider, and not really the role of the client or the patient to engage with. And so that puts a lot of pressure on the on providers to pretend that they could actually acquire all of the knowledge that would be necessary to understand the general cultural practices and experiences that inform a particular person's identity, and often that leads to stereotyping and generalizations according to different groups that they might be part of, and it also emphasizes to the patient that it's the provider that has the power, the provider that controls this process of interpreting and understanding the identities. It doesn't allow for a robust understanding of intersectional identity, and closes the possibility of allowing the individual to discuss and to share who they are and who they choose to be, what they choose to emphasize about their multiple identities. And so in this regard, Hook and colleagues, I think, really sum up my preferred definition of cultural humility, actually my preferred one I'm going to share with you later, but a really useful one. The ability to maintain an interpersonal stance that's other-oriented, that's open to the other in terms of what's most important to them to emphasize, not what I see, not my assumptions or attributions based on their appearance, based on what I know about them because of boxes that they check off, or what other colleagues have told me. That cultural humility invites me, and this is now a preview to the skills of cultural humility, invites me to reserve judgment, to kind of clean my slate, to kind of check my biases, and to acknowledge that as a human being, I have biases. And those biases, regardless of my identity, regardless of whatever credentials, whatever work I have done, whatever anti-racist work, whatever anti-sexist work, anti-heterosexist and homophobic work I've done, that I'm still impacted by these structural forces. I'm still impacted by the values that are so prevalent in our society that would marginalize people, that I cannot separate myself from them, that they creep in ways that operate outside of my awareness. So that reserving judgment is a key and challenging skill. Active listening, reflecting, these are skills, these are things that social workers do well, but we need to continue to work on and develop, and that we need resources that we don't always have, like time and space, and a supportive environment that values these skills, and that ultimately understanding the experience of the other as if you were them, understanding their worldview, placing yourself in their world is really ultimately the way to connect with compassion and with authenticity, that in ways where also students, families, clients will feel safe and able to partner with you as being the experts on their identity. And so in this regard, it's not listed here, but these are really useful skills that Ortega and Fowler articulate, but they're also undergirded by the skill of not knowing, or informed not knowing. The idea that it's more important for me to see the client as the expert, and that my ability to develop the skills to elicit from them in a reciprocal manner who they are, what's important to them, what are important aspects of their identity, is really key and critical in cultural humility work and building our cultural humility.
That's how we learned that school uniforms is about avoiding conflicts with gangs. So last year, the keynote speaker was Dr. Kenneth Hardy, and we want to build on an invitation that he shared at last year's conference, which was this invitation to engage in continuous self-interrogation. Dr. Hardy argued that this self-interrogation supports us in building our cultural humility skills. Because, as Tony said, we're all human, we all have biases and prejudice, and we may not always live in an environment where it's safe to talk about those things, but to pretend we don't have them is a falsehood, right? So one of the ways that we engage in this self-interrogation is by engaging in this oops, ouch dichotomy. Do you want to talk a little bit about how that emerges in your class?
Sure. So when I was at Hunter, we would have a power and privilege orientation. Perhaps some of you are graduates of Hunter School of Social Work. You remember that orientation. My understanding is that it was heavily informed by Columbia University School of Social Work and other places, but that certainly I want to credit S.J. Dodd for teaching me this tool of being able to use oops and ouch in an active environment where we might experience things that people say or do, and the opportunity to say oops acknowledges that I'm aware that I've just said something or I've done something that did not convey what I meant to convey, or that reflected some kind of conflict or some kind of influence in my behavior that either I'm not proud of or that I need to continue to work on. These kinds of slips happen frequently. And then the use of the word ouch to really convey something that was said or done that I experienced as hurtful. And perhaps often the person did not intend it that way, but that's how it was experienced. These tools in conversation and dialogue, in facilitation, enable us to kind of stop the action and investigate, interrogate, understand more deeply what went on. But it takes a certain comfort level with oneself and self-reflection in ways that go back to the political and critical, cultural, educational autobiography to feel comfortable to be able to use them. So one example for me is years ago, a couple, a Puerto Rican academic couple. He's a professor, she's an administrator, who we were getting to know better. We were having dinner with them, and I knew I actually knew the wife first, but in our conversation, she talked about some experiences that she had in her doctoral program. And I reflected that that I did not know that she had completed her doctorate, and that as I said that, I became aware that I made the assumption that in their relationship that he was the one that had the PhD, he was the one that had that status, and that she did not, and so that was acknowledging and reflecting that there's something about my upbringing, my experiences that were deferential to the man. That certainly.
Or it couldn't be both, like Lily. I want both.
Right, and certainly Lily has both.
Lily has both, yeah.
And I think in this regard, we had a really good discussion about it. And there was no judgment because of the nature of the relationship, but certainly there's always a concern, a fear and anxiety that will be judged, right? But in this regard, I've certainly come to accept and understand that all of these isms, all of these perspectives that would diminish the value of who people are exist in me, and I've got to actively work to acknowledge them and be aware of them, and that's difficult to do when we're under pressure, when we're under time pressure, when we've got multiple and competing demands in front of us that we've got to reflect in action as well. So I think that this is an important example and dimension that we want to offer you, and we want to invite you to think about in your practice.
May I share my observations as a witness of your oops? Well, the first thing I thought was, what is she going to say? Because it was made clear that there was this assumption that despite the fact that they both worked in this institution of higher ed, that only he was the doctor. And I was really impressed with both you, Tony, and our friend, because she smiled, she was very warm about it, and I was struck that you said out loud what you were thinking, which you could not have. You could have just been corrected in silence and sat there, but I was struck that you said out loud, wow, I think I assumed that only your husband had the doctorate. Might that be like a sexist microaggression that came up for me? Like you were saying that out loud, and she smiled and kind of touched you on the shoulder and said, maybe. And he said, gosh, I really got to reflect on that. So it was really fascinating to witness this really vulnerable moment of self-interrogation, because sometimes when we make those mistakes, we're kind of sheepish about it. Or really angry. The person can be really angry about it. So we do want to preface that there was a relationship already there, right? There's the foundation of a friendship. But in the spirit of talking more about self-interrogation, I will share one of my oops moments. And it was actually when I was an MSW intern. And I too went to Hunter College School of Social Work, and I interned at a community-based organization which is still thriving and alive and well, Cypress Hills local community in East New York, Brooklyn. And among the many things that Cypress Hills did is they supported several parent groups that were organizing around school overcrowding and trying to get more funding for the school district. And they developed one of the first small New Vision schools, which was a dual language school that had a parent co-director and a teacher co-director. In any case, I remember as a younger MSW community organizing intern being in a meeting where I'm taking the minutes, and there's these really energetic Latina, Puerto Rican, and immigrant parent organizers talking about how they were going to trying to get the attention of the superintendent to make sure that there's more funding in the capital plan for our side of the district. There was another part of the district that was wealthier and whiter, and was able to vote our side of the district because we had a lot of transient and immigrant and not yet documented folks did not have votes as power. We had other things that we mobilized as power. And I had kind of this romantic moment where I was like with my people, I was with my gente, and I said it out loud, right? Like, oh, I didn't realize you both had a degree. I said, oh, you know, I'm here, I'm with my people. Like, I'm so happy to be doing this work. This is my work, but it's also my life. And I identified as somebody who was working poor, as a project public housing baby, and as a resident of a neighborhood who also wasn't prioritized by the city. And one of the Latina mothers, Erica, said to me in a way that I'll never forget, quite curt, we're not your people, we're your project. We're an assignment. We're an assignment on this learning agreement with your field education, right? With the MSW program. And my heart was pierced, but for me it was an important moment because even though there was a lot of identification, it's important to recognize that privilege is not only when we're part of the royal family, right? Privilege is also that in that moment my poverty was voluntary and temporary because I was a struggling graduate student. It's important to mention that while I'm supporting them and getting more resources for their schools, it wasn't my kid who was in the school who didn't have the resources for people to be at reading level and who were overly punished. In fact, I didn't even have a kid, so I didn't even have that perspective. Right? And I was learning how to become an organizer, and in many ways it was an assignment, even though from my perspective I gave above and beyond, but it's important to notice that there was a difference there, right? And we can't always pretend that we are one, right? So privilege is also very subtle. And what Erica taught me in that moment is even when we don't mean it, even when it's said from a place of unity and romanticism, it's insulting to others when we fail to recognize our privilege, right? And I share that story. We share these stories. They're not stories we're proud of, but we share them because we're all human and we all do it. Many of you have just gotten a handout, right, from the conference organizers. Yes? Okay.
We'll make them available electronically.
Yes.
But we won't have time to do the exercise.
Okay.
But we invite you to use the handout and to use it as a tool to think about how you might, on your own, maybe even over lunch, have that discussion with one other person. And it invites you to be vulnerable in terms of talking about that experience with the other person.
Right. And think about what was it like for you to witness somebody else's self-interrogation, and what was it like for somebody to witness yours?
So, Mara Gottlieb, who's here in New York City, did a presentation in Connecticut last month, and also does wonderful work in the area of cultural humility. And she advances these principles for cultivating cultural humility. So I want to mention them, and then I'm going to end before we have Q&A with a beginning working definition of cultural humility that I want to advance, or we want to advance. So commit to an ongoing process of compassionate self-awareness and inquiry. So the self-interrogation is an important component of that. Cultivate a community of trusted and cognitively diverse colleagues. How do we get different perspectives on our practice and our own personal development? Be open and teachable. Strive to see cultures as our clients see them rather than as we have come to know or define them. Check our assumptions, check our attributions based on what we see or what limited information we might know. Emphasize the skill of not knowing. Consider social structures and systems that shape reality as our clients experience, including how and to who they assign power and privilege. So in this regard, we may not see ourselves as powerful or privileged in our particular work context, but we are very powerful and influential in terms of decisions that we make or decide not to make, and how they might influence a student or a family, and how that occurs within a set of dynamics and power relationships in the workplace. So that macro perspective, that structural analysis, that structural racism analysis is critical and essential to this work. And to reinforce it again, remain aware of our considerable power as practitioners, both real and perceived, and seek to equalize that imbalance to the greatest extent possible. So these principles really kind of synthesize much of what we've shared in terms of cultural humility. And kind of that bottom quote there really is bringing together Schoen and Freire's concepts, but that critical cultural humility is reflection in action and reflection on action in order to transform the world. From reviewing many of these definitions, I decided to, and in writing that I'm doing in progress, will incorporate this definition, and will certainly welcome your feedback. But critical cultural humility is a professional interpersonal orientation informed and engaged by deep reflection on one's evolving intersectional identity, because where we are today is not where we started, and it's constantly evolving. And how it informs our assumptions and behavior towards others, characterized by an acceptance that cultural knowledge is complex, always political. That means it's always infused by power dynamics, and individuals deserve the opportunity to have their identities respectfully understood and incorporated into decision making. An acknowledgement of one's own self-interest. What am I getting out of this? If not, at a minimum, a salary, a career, the opportunity,
practice
through my own my own professional journey to further my own personal goals, for better and for worse. But nobody in this room, I assume, is independently wealthy. So we have an interest in this work. And a willingness to reflect on our own biases in action are essential features of this concept of critical cultural humility. So with that, we thank you for your engagement.
We want to close it out. So we just want to say super quickly what this means for school social workers, right? So this educational political autobiography must always be updated throughout our life. During the Q&A, we're happy to tell you the different perspectives we have now that we were on the parent side of engaging in school choice. And while we may not have power over everything, we have power over ourselves, right, and our reactions and the responsibility of being aware. And lastly, micro and macro must be married. And with that, we'll end, and we're happy to answer questions. Thank you.
So perhaps we have time for one question. Not all at once.
Or reactions.
Well, it's sort of a comment maybe, and I'd love to hear sort of your thoughts, comments. So I think both of you had a background in school social work and then went on to PhDs in education, is that correct? So I'm just sort of my own positionality. I'm a professor of social work, and I teach school social work, PhD school social worker, and then PhD in social work. And I do a lot of international work, but one of the reasons I love this conference so much is because we have exactly these conversations, and I think these conversations are really lacking in our profession as school social workers, and I train school social workers, and I'm a part of the National School Social Work Association. And it's just a frustration kind of where we are as a profession versus where we really need to be. So I just wanted to thank you for sort of bringing these conversations in, but I just wish that there was a way that I think that we could do more with making sure that social workers, and not just school social workers, but social workers have as a foundation of their own orientation some of the critical theories that you reflected here, and that's often not a part of our education as social workers. And then I think that creates just such our work could be so much richer if we had that foundation. And I bring in my international experiences. I have a colleague from Latin America here now, but in experiencing school social workers in Latin America and Argentina and other places, it's a part of their foundation, right? So they're always looking at things through this critical lens, and it's so refreshing and questioning things. So it's not, I don't know if I have a direct question, but I just would love just to hear kind of your own thoughts on that, and maybe some thoughts about how that could happen or how we could move in that direction in a more intentional way in terms of school social work and social work more generally.
We were involved in a discussion in our department a couple of years ago around changing the name of our department. Had been called Social Work and Latino Community Practice, and there was experiences by many students who felt excluded from that name. And so as part of our discussions, we wanted to assert the name Equitable Community Practice in association with our department, so that it would remind us that our profession is one that emphasizes equity and justice, even as we participate in larger systems that are not focused on equity. They're really focused on maintaining inequality. And that, to think about Herbert Gans and his famous work on the functions of poverty from here at Columbia, that social workers benefit from this larger system. And we are not always reflective of that. So I think that's one important part, and we have to acknowledge that in order to transcend it and overcome it and use the resources that we have to be involved in change.
Sorry, real quick question, Cindy. I see Cindy waiting. Hi, I'm Catherine. I wanted to just inquire about, because I feel that this language and presentation is something that I find very accessible to me as a social worker, but one of the things I find being a social worker in a school is how do I make this accessible to teachers, to educators, to the principal, so many things I wrote down that you said that I'm like, this is a problem at my school. This is a problem at my school. The ways in which they describe parents, the ways in which they don't acknowledge how they show up in other ways and engage in other ways that might not be exactly how they see. So how do you translate this to educators who come from a different, just different background?
Mm-hmm. Lots and lots of examples from real life, and often having them name the examples first and then bring in the theory underneath it. But once you name your example, and that happened just as we were getting coffee, there were all these, there's a lot of friends in the audience and colleagues who've been telling us these little snippets of troubling moments or moments of hope, right? In those moments, make sure that it's rooted in whatever you see in real life in your school, and then bring in the concepts. Because once we bring in the concepts first, it's kind of $10 words and people kind of tune out, right? Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
That's good. Weren't they great? Thank you. I hate to be the sand person, but we do have a 10-minute break, so you will have time because they will be with us throughout the day to ask them some questions. So please take time to connect with one another. You have 10 minutes, so we're going to start up again at 10 minutes from right now. Enjoy your break. Drink a lot of coffee and eat that breakfast that we got for you. Oh, hello.